Hello everyone. Terrible photos have been coming out of Sudan and unbelievable news of unbelievable violence has been coming out of that country. And I wanted to educate myself about what is happening there, what the situation is. And when I collected some data, I was shocked because I think that this situation is different than almost all the modern day war that we have seen. And I want to explain why. And I also want to use this video to give an overview to people about the context of this war, about why it's happening, and a brief history of Sudan. Because on social media, I just heard a lot of people saying that they do have some context over what was happening in Israel and Gaza, but they have no context of what is happening in Sudan. So they want to educate themselves, and I'm going to try with all the research that I have done. And if I go wrong, please feel free to correct me, feel free to tell me anything that I have missed in the comments, because the more times you read this, the more layers unlock in your brain. You are able to see the same thing differently. There are so many connections. So let's start. We are going to start with a brief history of Sudan. Sudan is a sub-Saharan country and it exists at the meeting point of the African continent and the Middle East. This is very important also to understand the present condition, the present situation. Sudan used to be an Anglo-Egyptian colony. So it used to be colonized by the British and by Egypt. And in the year 1956 is when it got its independence. Sudan became an independent country in the year 1956. However, the war which is happening in Sudan right now is not the first conflict. This country has seen a history of conflict. It has already seen 2 civil wars and 1 genocide before the current conflict. And the first civil war in Sudan had already started before it officially formally announced its independence. Independence was achieved in the year 1956, and the first civil war in Sudan had already begun in the year 1955, and it was fought until the year 1972. Who was fighting this war? Basically, the south part of Sudan. At that time, Sudan and South Sudan, the modern day Sudan and South Sudan, were one country. It was all Sudan. And the part which is known as South Sudan today, they felt discriminated against, they felt underrepresented, and that was the crux. They felt like the government in the north, which was basically governed by the Arab elite, did not represent them. They were overlooked, they were not taken care of, and they were treated as second class citizens. This was the reason that the first civil war began. The first civil war ended in 1972 with an agreement known as the Addis Ababa Agreement. So it already stretched on for over a decade. And this first civil war in Sudan, it gave regional autonomy to South Sudan. So Sudan was still one country, South Sudan was still not an independent country, but the southern part of Sudan was given regional autonomy so that they can make their own decisions for their own well-being if they feel like the government doesn't represent them well, right? Regional autonomy was given to South Sudan. However, just a few years, this is 1972, and just around 11 years after this, in 1983, the central government of Sudan said that it wants to impose the Sharia law on all of Sudan, including South Sudan, which was not a Muslim majority. And oil was discovered in South Sudan around like 1970s to 80s. This intensified the war because now the government wanted control over oil. So they tried to take away the regional autonomy of South Sudan and they tried to impose Sharia law on South Sudan. This led to the Second Civil War of Sudan, starting from the year 1983, and it went on until the year 2005. At the end of 2005, a comprehensive peace agreement was signed, and eventually in 2011, South Sudan became an independent country, separate from Sudan. So starting 2011, South Sudan and Sudan are two different countries, right? Now, in the year 2003, the region of Sudan known as Darfur, it saw another massacre. This was, by the way, I need to mention this. The Second Civil War of Sudan, which eventually led to the formation of South Sudan, is considered as one of the deadliest wars in the world since World War II. So, over 2 million deaths were recorded in this Second Civil War of Sudan. So, Sudan had already seen a lot of bloodbath until now. Now, in the year 2003 to 2005, in the region of Sudan known as Darfur, which is also where Al-Fashir is, which we hear a lot in news right now about, the region of Sudan known as Darfur, a genocide took place. And this is extremely important for us, and this is also extremely important for what is happening right now. Okay. So, why was this genocide taking place and who were fighting? Why did it take place? Who were fighting? Again, the fight was between the Arab identifying groups and the non-Arab identifying groups. I think this is the third time in this video or fourth that I am saying Arab identifying and non-Arab identifying, but we are talking about Africa. So why am I saying Arab identifying? This will be addressed in the next question. But for now, some groups identify as their cultural identity is Arab, and some groups, especially the indigenous groups of the Darfur region, some of them are Fur group, the Masalit group, the Zaghawa group. They identify as African indigenous groups. They do not identify with the Arab culture. And there was a war between these two groups. Why again? Because the non-Arab identifying groups that I have just named, they felt underrepresented, they felt discriminated against. They said that they were being treated as second-class citizens in their own land. And that is why this rebellion broke out. And during this rebellion, Sudan was under the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. So he was the dictator of Sudan during this rebellion. There's something that he did in order to crush this rebellion. And this step that he took, it forms a major reason of why Sudan is seeing what is happening right now. Omar al-Bashir took the help of a paramilitary force, a militia known as the Janjaweed militia. What is the Janjaweed militia? What was the Janjaweed militia? Janjaweed militia was a paramilitary force of local fighters and goons who belonged to Arab identifying tribes. So remember this, the non-Arab identifying tribes are breaking out in a rebellion. The government is heavily identified with the Arab identifying population, and Janjaweed militia already exists, but it exists as a rogue paramilitary force. It's not backed by the government up until this point, at least not formally. This is just a group of Arab men and boys who believe in Arab supremacy, who believe in the supremacy of their Arab identity, and they are willing to fight for it and they are willing to kill for it. The government of Omar al-Bashir formally takes the help of Janjaweed militia to crush the rebellion by non-Arab tribes. Janjaweed militia is known for its brutality, and during this rebellion, the Darfur Genocide of 2003, they carry out mass killings. They burn entire villages of people with non-Arab indigenous identities, and they carry out systematic sexual violence. They use rape as a weapon of war. in order to instill fear and terror in the groups which are breaking out in rebellion, in order to discourage them from rebelling again. So, one of the reasons why Omar al-Bashir is said to have taken the help of this rogue paramilitary force, Janjaweed Militia, who are known for their brutality, is that he wanted to crush the rebellion with the kind of brutality that the SAF, the Sudanese armed forces, could not publicly associate with. So he had given his consent to the Janjaweed militia to carry out the village burnings, to carry out mass rape, to carry out genocide. But the Sudanese armed forces could not be seen doing these things out in public. So because the Sudanese armed forces could not be seen associated with this kind of brutality in public, the help of Janjaweed militia was taken in order to crush the rebellion. Al-Bashir was indicted by ICC later for crimes against humanity. And this Janjaweed militia has a very important role to play in what is happening right now. But before that, I want to explain, why am I saying Arab identifying and non-Arab identifying? Aren't all Sudanese Africans? Yes, all people from Sudan, all Sudanese people are Africans. Biologically and historically, they are all Africans. But as I had already mentioned, Sudan lies at the crux, at the meeting point of the east end of the African continent and then the Middle East. So because Sudan is at this position, historically there has been a lot of flow because of trade, because of marriages, and then when Islam was introduced to Sudan, that also led to a lot of inflow of the Arab culture. So the Arab versus non-Arab identity in Sudan, if I have to say it in very simple words, is more of a political, social and linguistic identity than it is a biological identity. It is, most people look the same, they are all Africans, but the identity is which culture do you associate with more? Do you associate with the indigenous African culture or do you associate with the Arabic culture? It's the war that is happening right now is also not about religion, because Sudan is an overwhelmingly Muslim country. And a lot of the people who are doing the killing and a lot of the people who are being killed both pray to the same God. So it's not about religion, it's about a cultural and political identity. And it is also worth noting, because any Indian hearing this, you guys remember when the British came, they had a policy of divide and rule. They had apparently a similar policy in Sudan, and it's known as indirect rule. I think in Sudan they called it indirect rule, which is that they treat people of different ethnic identities differently. Some people are given preferential treatment over the others. So people can never come together as a cohesive force to fight the British Empire. So the Arab identifying people were often treated with a degree of preferential treatment that the non-Arab identifying or indigenous tribes were not given. This is what led to a very, very long series of differences between the Arab identifying and non-Arab identifying population. Now what is happening right now, and who are the two people who are fighting right now? What is happening and who are fighting right now? So we all learnt about the Janjaweed militia that Omar al-Bashir used in order to crush the rebellion in the year 2003. The funny thing is that the interesting thing is that after that rebellion was very, very brutally crushed, the Janjaweed militia over the years was given a quasi-formal status in the country. So do not get me wrong, it still was not a formal military force. It still was a rogue force which the government could not control entirely. What people did in that militia, it couldn't be entirely brought to accountability. But because they had helped the government in order to crush the rebellion, the government over time gave them a quasi-formal status, and the Janjaweed militia over time formed, or over time it became the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. So while RSF was not the formal Sudanese armed forces, Sudanese armed forces was a different body, and RSF was not a formal government body, but it was given a semi-recognition by the government, and it was treated almost like an intelligence agency, you know. And in 2021, in a coup, the Sudanese armed forces and RSF, they overthrew the reign of Omar al-Bashir. So the organization that Omar al-Bashir had supported, they along with the Sudanese armed forces overthrew his reign. Now currently, in the current scenario, Sudanese armed forces is led by, which is the formal army of Sudan, but they are not necessarily the good guys or the heroes. Sudanese armed forces over time has been accused of just as much, if not more, brutality as RSF. But a lot of the times RSF was brought into pictures because SAF could not be publicly associated with the actions that had to be taken. Sudanese armed forces is led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Okay, I hope I took the name correctly. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, is also led by a commander, and the chain of loyalty in Rapid Support Forces is not to a country. The chain of loyalty is not even to an ideology. It's not to a religion. The chain of loyalty is to a person. This is an important, really important distinction to make. When one studies about the RSF, the chain of loyalty is to the commander. It's not to any religion or philosophy or ideology. RSF is led by a man whose name is Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo. Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo, and his nickname is Hemeti. That is the nickname of the person who's heading the RSF right now. And Hemeti was promoted by Omar al-Bashir. At some point, they were allies and they were fighting the non-Arab identifying tribes, or they were trying to crush them together. Then RSF and SAF became allies and they overthrew Omar al-Bashir. Now, right before the current conflict in Sudan began around the month April 2023, and right before this conflict there was pressure by the Sudanese armed forces that the RSF gets formally integrated into the Sudanese army. So the Sudanese armed forces wanted to integrate RSF into their formal army, but RSF did not want to have any of this idea, because I have already mentioned the chain of command in RSF. The loyalty is not to a nation, the loyalty is not to a religion or an ideology, the loyalty is to the commander. And RSF did want to remain an autonomous entity that is not controlled by the government. This led to the starting of the current conflict, which is between the Sudanese armed forces and RSF. There is something very important that one needs to know about the RSF and Hemeti. So I have already mentioned that Hemeti is the guy who is the leader of RSF, and Hemeti is also the guy whose family, him and his family are basically, they run a company known as Al Junaid Multi Activities Coal Limited in Sudan. Mr. Hemeti, the leader of Rapid Support Forces, and his family, they own a company known as Al Junaid Multi Activities Co Limited. Why is this relevant? Because this company known as Al Junaid, based in Khartoum in Sudan, it controls almost all of the gold that is obtained from Sudan. almost all of the gold is single-handedly controlled by this man and his family. And this man is also the leader of the paramilitary force in Sudan, RSF, that is not under the control of the government and which is allowed to basically exercise as much brutality as it wants, and there is no one to hold it accountable. When I read this, my alarms were blazing, because it's almost like in India, if Ambani, Mr. Mukesh Ambani, owns his own private army, and that army is not under the control of the government, and that army is allowed to do pretty much whatever it wants, and that army goes to all the areas in India that has oil mines, and it decides to violently take control of those areas and drive out all the local villagers from those areas. This is dystopian, because this is, the conflict of interest is too high. Mr. Hemeti is the leader of RSF, which is a paramilitary force which has its own weapons, its own powers, and he also single-handedly controls most of the gold that goes out of Sudan. And my first question was, how was it allowed to happen? How was this is like, I cannot imagine something like this happening in a functional democracy. This is too big of a conflict of interest. But this was apparently allowed to happen because Omar al-Bashir needed the RSF. So the wealthy and powerful men formed a coalition and they bended rules so that they could get away with whatever they wanted to get away with. Hemeti was not born rich. He joined the Janjaweed militia and he grew up in the ranks, and because the RSF has such ammunition and such power, they control presently almost all of the gold rich areas of Sudan. And around in the year 2025, if I'm right, around 90-95% of the gold that came out of Sudan was exported to UAE. So, and it was exported by Junaid company. The company exports gold through formal pipelines, and it also smuggles gold to the neighboring countries. And this company, a lot of the times, it's known to bypass the Sudanese central banking system. So it operates like a cartel. It operates like a warlord cartel. Like there is no accountability, there is nobody to stop them, and it is operating on absolute private profit. Who mines the gold for the RSF? Sometimes the RSF, the tribes, the Arab identifying tribes that support the RSF are involved in mining. Sometimes the migrant workers from neighboring countries are involved in mining. Sometimes villagers and children from the neighboring villages are forced into mining the gold for them with almost zero safety. Okay, so the present conflict is between RSF and SAF, and by this time I think we have all understood that this conflict is not about religion. This conflict is not even anymore about the Arab or non-Arab identity. It is about control over gold. The RSF controls the gold, and the gold that they get and sell very often bypasses the Sudanese central bank, and it ends up in Hemeti's and his family's private bank accounts. There is no contribution that gold makes to the Sudanese economy. One question that I was shocked by is because RSF or the Janjaweed militia, they have not been officially identified as, before I get to this, Junaid has been sanctioned by the US, and in light of the current reports against this company, UAE has started an investigation apparently because of the growing international pressure and the news and the crazy pictures that are coming out of Sudan. So, if you go to this website, it's called opensanctions.org, opensanctions.org. You will see Al Junaid listed there. If you go to the OFAC SDN list of sanctioned companies, Al Junaid has been flagged as a threat to peace and security. So this company, Hemeti's company, has been sanctioned from multiple places, but I don't know if it's enough. I don't know that it's going to bring real change. One of the questions that I had while studying this was that the Janjaweed militia or the present day RSF, they have not been formally recognized or called as a terrorist organization by the UN or by any of the international bodies, but a lot of top RSF leaders have sanctions against them, and it is incredibly violence. Violence is the name of the game, and it is not violence is not mean a necessary thing. Like, it's not like we don't have an option, that's why we are being violent to meet our ends. Violence is just the way of life. They go to these villages, they kill all the boys, they rape women in mass, and violence is the easiest available way to instill terror, so that the people being driven away, they don't even think of fighting back. And one question that kept coming in my mind is, why is this organization so violent? It is incredibly brutal, and it has retained its methodology of brutality throughout history. It has never become something less brutal. It has actively avoided integrating into the national armed forces. It has actively avoided evolving into something that is less brutal and more palatable. The RSF has actively remained brutal, which is not what one can say of most organizations which operate with a certain degree of brutality in certain time periods. Over time, they want to be accepted by formal politics, by the mainstream politics, and they have to make themselves more palatable. But I don't see that in the RSF history, and the only guess I could come up with, that a lot of the people, fighters, they are recruited from poor neighborhoods, they are untrained, and they are taken from marginalized communities. There is recruitment of boys as young as 14. So young children are recruited into RSF, and then from that age they become desensitized to violence. Violence becomes a way of life, and the chain of command is such that your loyalty is to no one else but to what your leader says. That is how you survive. You don't survive because of empathy, you don't survive because of your beliefs. So, who is controlling Sudan right now? It's a very dire situation. Most parts of Khartoum, Port Sudan, and what can be called the eastern parts of Sudan are still controlled by the Sudanese armed forces, who are also leading a de facto government, or whatever is left of it from those areas. Majority of the Darfur, the Kordofan, and recently Al Fashir, they have been brutally captured by RSF, and those are also the regions with the most concentration of gold mines. Both sides, the SAF and RSF, have been accused of war crimes. So one of my questions that I had written is, are they the good guys? And no, I don't think, there is no evidence. Again, this war is not being fought because of an ideological difference. SAF and RSF used to be allies. They have both committed war crimes, and they have both helped each other commit war crimes. It's right now not about good versus evil. It's not about Muslims versus non-Muslims or Arabs versus non-Arabs. It's two political paramilitary forces which have weapons and guns, and RSF receives a lot of funding also because of the gold, which is why it's able to get so much ammunition for itself. These are two bodies which are heavily armed, and they are fighting for domination, they are fighting for resources, they are fighting for the gold, for oil, and for farmlands. They are not fighting for people, they are not fighting for an ideology. So, unfortunately, there is no good guy. And I also want to mention right now that there are reports multiple times that both the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and RSF, Rapid Support Forces, have driven UN convoys or the support that UN bodies have provided. They have actively or sometimes violently driven that support out of their regions, because sometimes both of these parties look at the UN not as a body that is trying to help the civilians which are caught in crossfire. They look at the UN as a meddling force. They look at UN as a force that is trying to interfere in their personal matter. So both of these bodies have driven out UN support actively from their regions. One more question that I want to address that came to my mind, because everybody is referring to this conflict as a civil war. Is this conflict in Sudan a civil war? Now, even the UN, various reputed publications refer to this as a civil war. In my understanding, a civil war would be when a certain section of society feels represented by one of the two fighting parties. I highly doubt that anyone on ground as a civilian who is caught in the crossfire feels represented by either the RSF or the SAF. I have repeatedly said that this is not even about religion. It is purely about two very powerful, wealthy forces trying to have a domination over the resources for their own personal benefit. They are not representing people, and they will kill anyone and anything that comes in their way. So, whether or not this conflict should be referred to as a civil war is a very big question for me, because which civilian is being represented? RSF is fighting for control over gold, which it's going to share with Hemeti and a few people that support it. SAF is also fighting for control over that same gold. People belonging to all religions and all tribes are being driven out and killed. How is this a civil war if none of the fighting parties are representing any civilian or any agenda or any political ideology, left versus right? Nothing. This is truly purely about greed. It's not about the vision even that these parties have, that these forces have about the future of Sudan. That is what makes it so heart-wrenching for me, because there is a certain level of absolute hollowness and lack of purpose. The thing is, in my opinion, wars are always fought because of profit. Even when people say that they are being fought for something else, they are always fought for profit. But at least the governments try to pretend. They try to pretend that a war is being fought to save their religious identity. A war is being fought to save their right to self-determination. A war is being fought for their survival. Here, there is not even any layer of pretense. Here, these are two extremely blatantly resource-hungry, weaponized paramilitias, and they are fighting this war because they want monopoly over the gold. And no matter who dies, it's okay with them. This is it is a bit difficult to believe that something like this can happen in the 21st century. It's heart-wrenching. Moving on, Where does the gold go? So I've already said that around 90% of Sudan's gold, either legally or illegally, is documented mostly to be going to the UAE. But there are also ties with Russia and Libya from what I have read. So again, we have to wait and see, because I'm sure there are multiple players involved. Although UAE is still, it's well documented that it is the largest and the most important player. Now, what can you and I do? I thought the first thing that I could do was I could educate myself, because it's so important that so many people are dying and being subjected to horrific violence, and sexual violence is being used as a proper weapon of war by the RSF to humiliate women, to humiliate tribes, and to instill a sense of terror into these tribes so that there is not much fighting back. There have been several reports that, the UN organizations' convoys have been driven out by both SAF and RSF, and the ground situation is so unpredictable. I don't think it's not possible to get accurate journalistic insights into what is happening, especially in the RSF controlled regions. Journalists are not being spared. The UN officials, the UN workers in these areas are not being spared. Even Netanyahu from Israel, he had to come to the UN conference in New York, and he had to at least say that he is not stopping any UN convoys going to Gaza. At least he had to say that, whether or not that is being carried out. But here, both RSF and SAF are blatantly and openly stopping the UN convoys, and there is very little ground reporting. So it is not always possible to know what exactly is happening. But I think if more people become aware, and if international pressure increases, even organizations such as the RSF can feel the pressure to protect their public image, because if the entire world turns on you, you are not going to have a political future. And even the biggest dictators know that. Even someone like a Putin or Netanyahu know that there's a lot of money spent on their PRs, because you can be very powerful and you cannot give a shit, but if the entire population turns against you, it's not going to go well in your favor. So the more people get aware, the more pressure can be put on these organizations to stop the kind of brutality that they're showing, and more accountability can be expected out of them. Even though most of UN bodies have been driven out, I think from what I have read recently, some bodies are still in operation, at least in the areas of eastern Sudan where the RSF has not completely taken a hold. Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, is still operating. So if you have money, consider donating. They are helping survivors of sexual violence in Sudan right now. They are helping a lot of women and children. UNHCR is still operating. They are supporting refugees from the areas of Darfur and Khartoum. IRC, International Rescue Committee, apparently is also in operation. So consider donating. Sudanese Red Crescent is another organization that I think is still in operation. I will link all of these in the video description. There are some local Sudanese women's groups that are helping women who have survived violence at the hands of RSF or SAF. It's a bit difficult to find out exactly who they are, but if, as and when I find the links, I will keep updating the description. If you have a link where we can donate, please type it in the comment section. For those of you in positions of power, relative power, try to spread awareness, try to talk to more people, try to talk to your local representative, because I know that sometimes when people in the so-called first world countries, first world nations talk about something, everyone wants to hear them. So keep reading about it, and my heart goes out to all the women and all people in Sudan, and I really hope that they all can find a home. If I have made any fallacies, if I am incorrect about any of these, please feel free to correct me in the comment section. Thank you.